Welcome, everyone. It is noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. People may continue to sign on, and that is completely fine. So thank you for joining us for the Better Behavior Together series. I'm Christy Ganya, a program manager with Telehealth Rocks. And just a little bit more about Telehealth Rocks. We are a federally funded program that focuses on school-based behavioral health, and we do this by working on social determinants, supporting school-based services, and then telemetry and training just like this one. I've got a couple of notes for you about the session before we get started. The session is being recorded and we will share that with you afterwards. Please give us a little bit of time to process that recording, but it should hopefully go out to your email tomorrow. Your microphone has been muted. You can use the chat or unmute to ask questions. And then certificates of attendance will be emailed after this three-part series is over. It is important and helps us track attendance if your name is visible on your Zoom screen with your first and last name, or feel free to type it in the chat. I will hand it to Melissa to get us started.
Fantastic. Thank you, Christy. And welcome everyone and happy Thursday. I hope that the weather where you are is just as beautiful as it is here today. My name is Melissa Maris. I am a clinical community psychologist here in Missouri. I've been consulting with the Telehealth Rocks team now for about 3 years. And am super pleased to welcome two additional friends to this call, and we'll ask them to just quickly unmute and say hello and tell us who they are. Alexis, you want to go first?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Alexis McMillan, and I have served in various roles in community mental health and as a school psychologist and overall in K-12 education. And I'm very excited to be, bridging the gap of mental health and education.
Hi, I'm Ashley Neely. I am currently the Director of School-Based Behavioral Health Services for Community Health Center of Southeast Kansas. I started out as their first school-based therapist and now kind of help direct that and grow it as we go. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Ashley. So just a couple of quick informational pieces as we move forward. So first, we don't have any project disclosures. And in terms of mitigating potential bias, we are always looking to the best of what we know from existing research. Also, just as an aside, we love talking about this. And so if you ever have any questions of where we're getting our information or have ideas or questions about those pieces, we really would invite you to contact us and have those conversations. The science in so many of these areas is moving so quickly. And so it really is not at all uncommon for things that we thought were best practice 5 years ago. Now we know that maybe there's a different strategy that can be more effective. So please feel free to connect with us if you have any questions about that, or we can talk your ear off about that. And in terms of other pieces, after the session, Christy will be sending out the slides and the recording as soon as they're processed. And they will send out certificates of attendance. Just wanted to highlight here this email address, so telehealthrocks@kumc.edu. If you have any questions, concerns, needs about things, that's where to go, and folks will get back to you as soon as possible. Okay, so in terms of our agenda for today, that was just our welcome, so check. And now we're going to go through kind of a brief didactic 10-15 minutes of background, and then shift to our case presentation. So a behavior scenario that our friend Polly Freeman has agreed to share. So this is a real case. We were just chatting with her before the call, and she was saying that this has been kind of tough and that she's feeling kind of stuck. And I said, this is a perfect case for this kind of format. So we're very excited to hear from her and to brainstorm as a group of some potential next steps that she might consider taking. And then we're actually going to do a breakout room with this Echo. And this is something a little bit new in terms of a format, but wanted an opportunity to gather in kind of smaller groups for some discussion. And then we'll come back here and wrap up. So I did want to tell you this scroll, this gray scroll on the bottom. You'll see it on the slides. And we're trying to use this to kind of identify very concrete, practical strategies with each of these different steps. In my mind, I'm imagining like royalty stepping up with one of those really long horns. That's the trumpet sound. But take a look at those on the slides for some additional information. So when we hear from our friend Polly, one of the things that we're going to hear is some discussion about anxiety, which fit very well into our conversation for this first of our Better Behavior series. And so this is just a very timely, very recent article from Education Week about anxiety. We're certainly hearing a lot from school friends like you all about how anxiety is disrupting education, disrupting attendance. And certainly this is very top of mind. So we're going to be talking generally about some concepts, but also kind of trying to focus in more specifically around anxiety. So if we go to the next slide, so really big picture reminder is that we all have brains, right? And this seems really obvious, but also just kind of wanted to remind you all of this hand model of the brain. We've gone through this and done this on multiple different echoes that we've done. But I think the really big picture take home here is that fundamentally teaching, modeling, practicing the "this is your brain" content in a school context is super duper helpful for all the things. So this means talking to students about it, talking to staff, administrators, school board members, parents, guardians, community members, creating a really nice baseline understanding of how our brains works helps with all kinds of things. And so while we're talking a little bit more specifically about anxiety today, really the same concepts apply. And I just wanted to highlight that even though we often are talking about the hand model and going through the different pieces with the hand within a context of talking about trauma-informed or trauma-responsive schools, the way our brains work is the same regardless of if we're talking about trauma or not, or stress, or a lot of other different mental health issues. So this is something that's absolutely generalizable across different kinds of challenges and challenging behaviors that we see in the school context. So if we go to the next slide, so when we think about this specifically for the anxious brain, one thing that we want to emphasize is that anxiety, stress, all of our feelings are valid, and to some degree, all of these feelings are completely natural and normal. And learning about our brains, specifically with anxiety, but in general, everything, is really helpful. And so just that reminder that, we think about our prefrontal cortex up here, our wizard brain, that's where rational thinking, logic, that's generally kind of where good choices tend to live. And then of course, really deep down in kind of that brainstem, the amygdala, that's where the emotions are. And oftentimes when we get really anxious or too stressed, that's when really that amygdala starts firing up and makes it harder for this part to work. And so I think a key message here is that when we're talking about anxiety, this is not an I won't brain, it's an I can't brain. And so we're talking with many of these behaviors, we're talking about young people and adults who aren't necessarily choosing these behaviors. It's not an active, conscious choice. They are doing the best they can, and maybe the best that they can do could be improved, and we want to change behavior, but kind of coming from that place of acceptance, that's really the trauma responsive component here. And just kind of wanted to highlight that when I talk to folks about brains and how brains work, and folks come and say, what about depression? What does that mean with the brain? Or what about this kind of situation? It helps, of course, to be responsive first to what people are specifically asking about. So this exact model could be used for all kinds of different stuff. This could be the depressed brain or the PTSD brain or any of those components, but it's helpful to start specifically with what people are asking about and then to generalize big picture. It helps people feel heard. I heard your question about anxiety, giving some information and saying, guess what's really cool? This stuff generalizes across different kinds of challenging behaviors. So just wanted to give you all a peek at that. And the other thing, if we go to the next slide, Christy, is that laughing is really, really good. Humor is good. And so even when we're talking about serious content and serious issues, what we know from research is that humor helps us learn, retain, and then also recall information much more easily. So this is one of many images that you can find online of a teenager's brain, of kind of different pieces that are happening there. Again, I think brain health and learning about brains is a really critical part of school mental health and mental health in general. And so oftentimes creating something like this is a different way to engage folks in content that might actually seem kind of heavy and a little bit kind of on the intellectualist side. So laughing is good. So laugh. Okay, so when we are talking about anxiety and any of our big feelings, what we're really talking about is kind of this idea of this window of tolerance. And so the idea that we all have feelings all the time, and our feelings go up and down in intensity all the time, but that in general, when we're kind of in that middle area, that window of tolerance, that's when our bodies are calm. That's when we're calm enough to learn. It's also when our brains are actually going to retain what's learned. And then we have these different kinds of phases. So escalation, so starting to feel threatened, this idea of hyper arousal. So this is, I am unsafe, brain is shutting down. We're starting to see that fight, flight, freeze kind of piece, kind of back into the window of tolerance, we're calm. And then we go to kind of the other side, the hypo arousal. So this is, distracted, avoidant. We often see this more in terms of it looks like depression. And then this idea of dissociation, so I'm too overwhelmed. So what I find helpful about looking at an image like this is that it's showing that all of our feelings kind of go up and down all the time, and that what we're trying to do is really help friends stay in this window of tolerance. And that's kind of what the idea is with a lot of these different coping strategies. We're not invalidating feelings. We're not telling people that they're feeling too much or too little. We're saying you're feeling what you're feeling. How can we help you cope with those feelings so that you can stay in the classroom and benefit from this terrific free and public education we're offering? Just a quick tip, if you all know, so you all know your audience, you know who you're working with, and oftentimes with something like window of tolerance, these are pretty clinical terms. And there are folks who absolutely will not really be able to take in content like dissociation without kind of spinning out and wondering what you're talking about. Choose different words. The beauty of Google now is that you can find an image for almost anything. And so if you like this concept but don't like the words, amazing. We're also happy to always find other images if this language doesn't really resonate with the folks that you're working with and you need some help finding other tools. So as we go to the next slide, just kind of wanted to highlight that when it comes to this sort of up and down kind of through these different layers around this window of tolerance, that this is a great place where things like feeling thermometers and feeling scales can be super duper helpful. So this is just one that I pulled, and I think Christy or someone else on our team will share a link. But the cool thing about the link that they're sharing is that actually goes to a whole bunch of different scales, thermometers, etc. The big take home here is that it's helpful if it's visual, obviously, but if the visual makes sense to the user. So if you're working with a younger child, engaging that young person and helping to develop a scale or a thermometer, and also that it includes internal and external signals for each level. So what that means is that if it's my thermometer, then I know what kinds of behaviors I can look for in myself to know whether I'm a 60 or a 20. It also means that people around me, so teachers, school counselors, maybe my friends, also know what it looks like when I'm a 60 or a 20. And so that way we can start to really put together the feelings and how big those feelings feel with what that looks like and might also kind of look like on the outside, but then also what I can start to notice about myself. That's a big piece of this, is that self-awareness and self-reflection, so that we can start to build that internal monitoring of what's going on, and then connecting to different strategies at that level. So we talked a little bit about it in the intro section about functional thinking, this idea of antecedent behavior consequence as being really helpful when we start to think about some of the most challenging behaviors that we see and really struggle to address in the school context. So ABCs just stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So antecedent is what happened before, the behavior is the behavior, and the consequence is what happened after. So when we think about consequence, that word leads us often to think about punishment or some kind of discipline, and it doesn't mean that. It can mean that, but it doesn't always mean that. It just means what happens after. And so this is kind of a way that when we're looking at behaviors, especially behaviors that are big and scary that we're not really sure how to respond to, maybe behaviors that seem surprising or even bizarre, these kinds of tools can be helpful to just start to put things in some sort of logical order, which will help our brains better be able to look at different pieces and kind of pull it apart and kind of understand what might be happening in different places. So kind of what happened before the behavior and what happened after. So this is a really, really helpful tip, and kind of one of my best suggestions, especially if you're working with folks outside of a school context, but also if you're working within the school context with special educators, school psychologists, community-based therapists, is that when we are describing behavior, the more specific we can be about that behavior and the more we can describe it with numbers, the more that we can describe it so that it's very, very clear, the easier it's going to be or the faster it's going to be for us to get help. So saying things like, Timmy does this a lot, is not as helpful as saying, Timmy does this 5 times a day, usually before lunch, in bursts of about 1 minute each. So the idea being that the better we can describe that behavior that's in the middle of this ABC cycle, the faster and better it's going to be in terms of getting us to strategies. Folks spend a lot of time coming in after a referral question is asked or a referral is made, just trying to better define the behavior. And so the more that we can define that behavior on the front end, the easier it's going to be to get to strategies and to get help. Okay, just a couple more slides, and then we are going to shift to hear from Polly about our case. So in terms of functional thinking, all this means is that behavior is communication. When we're thinking about behavior from a functional perspective, we're really looking at it and trying to figure out, what does this behavior want or need? What is it seeking? And this idea that behavior, functional thinking, that it eats. So this EATS, cute cat meme that might help you remember. So the idea that functions of behavior fall within one of these 4 categories. So either escaping, attention, something tangible, or something sensory. And we had some conversation in our intro session about, well, what if it falls into more than one of these categories? What if we want to make up a new category? I think the whole trick with functional thinking is to get started down a path of functional thinking. It helps teams have conversations in a different way, and shifts really to the antecedents and the consequences piece around that behavior and helps problem solving in that direction. And just a reminder, and this is really hard, I have a hard time with this, around keeping things simple. So what we know from a behavioral perspective, and also even from a trauma responsive lens, is that oftentimes when we're looking at behavior and we're looking at antecedents and consequences, that because that's really what we can start to change to then shift that behavior, is that oftentimes we want to look first at what is immediate, tangible, observable, and obvious. So when we're looking at behavior and we're kind of scratching our head saying, what's going on here? Sometimes our brains want to go to these really far away, complex places. Again, I am at fault of this all the time. But in reality, most often what's actually happening is very, very close to the behavior. And oftentimes it's really basic and simple. A great example of this is looking at behavior, having all of these complex theories, realizing that the behavior, the antecedent is that a child did not eat breakfast, right? And so like actually we can come up with all these things, but they were hungry. And maybe that's the reason for the behavior. So really, you know, Occam's razor, go for simple first. You can always make it more complicated and more complex later, but really trying to focus on the behavior, what immediately became before and right after, and starting there first rather than getting really big really quickly. And then finally, just a couple of quick comments about managing and mindfully dealing with these difficult emotions. So we're going to shift here in a second and hear from Polly about her case. But when it comes to anxiety, and this is generalized to lots of different feelings, but a couple of big things about anxiety specifically, and I think these do generalize across outside of anxiety. But one is there's lots of different steps to mindfully deal with difficult feelings, and different people have different people find different feelings really difficult. And so some people cope really well with feelings of anxiety, stress, some people don't. Some people cope really well with feelings of sadness, some people don't. And so different emotions kind of have that different level of difficulty depending on them. So there's definitely lots of different ways to kind of mindfully deal with those feelings. None of the ways of mindfully dealing with feelings include shutting those feelings down, saying those feelings don't matter. We're kind of moving in a different direction now, and I hear that more and more from school folks when I'm out in the community. So specific to anxiety, we really want to make sure front of mind that we are trying to avoid avoidance. This is often where we go to for a whole lot of reasons. So I'm really nervous. This is too hard. I don't want to do it. And it's, you know, in day-to-day kinds of pieces, we can see this when then we just we give in. We do this for ourselves by avoiding things that are hard. And part of it with anxiety that's really tricky is that when we do this, we are actually feeding the problem itself. Because really what we're saying to ourselves, or maybe saying to someone else, even if we don't mean to, is that this anxiety is bigger than you, it's badder than you, and you can't handle it. And so what we don't want to do is avoid, if at all possible. And also that if we're already in an avoidance place, that's okay, you're doing the best you can. Let's start to try to figure out how we move from this avoidance place back to a place where we're coping with feelings and managing those feelings and not just running away from them. Because the thing is you can't run far enough or fast enough, and you're gonna have to deal with it at some point. So let's work on this and this idea that sometimes we have to do hard things, but we don't have to do them alone. And so this idea of connection and really building on that connection piece. And then the final note about anxiety is really just reminding ourselves, and I have to do this all the time, but reminding ourselves that as adults in situations, oftentimes we are our own worst enemy when it comes to helping a young person deal with anxiety. And what I mean by this is that when we are interacting with another human, right, we feed off of what they're feeling and what they're doing, just like they feed off what we're feeling and what we're doing. It goes back and forth just like a tennis game, right? And so when a young person is feeling really nervous, feeling really anxious, it's very, very normal and typical for us to respond by also getting really nervous and anxious. And then what happens is just, it's like this, you know, pinball game when the little ball gets stuck and it's like, and it all just gets heightened. The hyperarousal just goes through the roof. And that's really normal, but also that means that we have to make sure that we are checking ourselves so that we are not further escalating. Oftentimes what I see is that a lot of the avoidance that comes into play is actually initiated by grownups, because grownups are having a hard time dealing with their own feelings about a young person's really challenging feelings. And again, this is not a criticism, it's just a recognition that it's hard to feel nervous. And it's hard to feel nervous a lot of the time, and we want to take care of people when people are having really hard feelings. We want to step in and make it better. But the reality is that nobody can feel your feelings except for you. And that includes all of us. So we have to make sure that we are regulating ourselves and managing ourselves so that we're not inadvertently kind of actually making it worse. And so with anxiety, I think that's a particular challenge because of just the nature of how anxiety works.